How strong is Japan's economy? Japan is the world's third largest economy, having achieved remarkable growth in the second half of the 20th century after the devastation of the Second World War. Japan's rapid post-war expansion, propelled by highly successful car and consumer electronics industries, ran out of steam by the 1990s under a mounting debt burden that successive governments have failed to address. In fact, Japan's gross domestic product, or GDP, is pretty much at the same level as it was in the 1990s. If you have a closer look and take inflation into account and consider real GDP, which is also referred to as constant price GDP, you'll see that Japan's economy has grown just slightly in the past years. Japan relies heavily on imports of agricultural products. The country's food self-sufficiency has stayed below 40% on a calorie basis for over a decade. Japan protects key sectors of its agricultural production with tariffs, which have contributed to high food costs in Japan. The focus of Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is on a series of measures known as Abenomics, aimed at boosting Japan's struggling economy, creating jobs and driving up wages. One of the goals of the central bank is to get inflation to 2%. Japanese have experienced deflation in the past, which meant that they could buy more in the future if they saved their money since prices were falling. Now inflation is positive, but this has only been made possible through the intervention by the Japanese central bank, which has bought a significant amount of government bonds to keep interest rates low and encourage investments. Keep in mind that Japan is the most indebted country in the world, carrying a substantial debt over 250% of GDP on its shoulders. And it continues accumulating more debt. And outlooks aren't that bright. The country has to deal with a shrinking population. The fertility rate is below 1.5 per woman, which will have large effects on the economy and in many areas like the job and housing market and consumer spending. Currently, Japan still has a population of about 127 million. A key part of Mr. Abe's policy of economy reforms involves getting more women into the workforce to tackle the demographic change. The country has a very strict immigration policy. Less than 2% of the population are foreign-born, and Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has no intention of changing that, despite a shrinking population. Japan has a rather disadvantaged location, given the frequent natural disasters that hit the island, including earthquakes, tsunamis and floods. The International Monetary Fund chief Christine Lagarde noted that the size of the economy and the population were on track to shrink by a quarter over the next 40 years. Despite these worrying indicators, Japan continues to be a stable and credit-worthy nation that attracts investors. And most of Japan's debt, including government bond liabilities, are held by its own citizens, so the risk of defaulting is much lower. However, according to the World Bank, Japan had to spend over 12% of its revenue on interest in 2016. If interest rates go up by several percent, this could become a serious threat for the economy, since Japan would have to spend a much higher portion of its revenue on interest payments alone, which would make it a lot harder for Japan to borrow new money to cover its expenses. Right now, Japan's population has a purchasing power parity that is equivalent to 220% of the world's average. The gross domestic product per capita in Japan was last recorded at $39,000 in 2017, when adjusted by purchasing power parity. If you want to stay on track about the economy of other countries, make sure to subscribe and check out my channel. See you later!